In this video, I've got 3 stories about people who made choices they can't take back, and what they did afterward might be even more disturbing than the choices themselves. If you're into real stories that are unsettling, mysterious, and a little hard to believe, you're definitely in the right place. Stick around, and if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. The case that was closed too quickly in Ohio. By the time the deputy reached the gravel pull-off above the creek, the flashlight beams were already moving over the reeds, and someone down in the dark was saying that the girl had been found on her back, not face down, and that her coat was folded beside her as if she had stopped there willingly. Before sunrise, that detail would begin to disappear. By noon, it would be gone from the official version entirely. The town sat low in the southern hills of Ohio, in that part of the state where the roads bent around old mines, churchyards, and patches of woods that never seemed to thin, even in winter. People there remembered sounds more than dates. A train at midnight, dogs barking toward the river, a screen door opening where no one should have been. The investigation began in one of those cold months when the fields turned colorless and every yard looked abandoned after dusk. She was in her early 20s, according to the reports that circulated first, and she had last been seen leaving a roadside place just outside town after the late shift. The usual pieces appeared quickly. A car left where it should not have been, a phone that stopped answering, a family that began calling before the county was ready to call it an emergency. Early newspaper accounts, the kind written fast and half from rumor, described a scene that did not match the conclusion that came later. One article mentioned marks on the slope above the creek, as if something heavy had been dragged through the frosted grass. Another said the first officer on scene believed there had been more than one person there. A radio bulletin, repeated for less than a day and then never again, stated that the body had been located several yards from the waterline, not in it, and that the victim's shoes were unusually clean for someone who had slipped down a muddy bank in the dark. Those reports were not formal evidence. They were only early fragments gathered in haste, but in small towns, the first version of an event leaves a stain. It does not wash out easily. The official explanation settled over everything with surprising speed. It was not dramatic, that was part of its strength. She had become disoriented, the public was told. There was poor visibility. The creek had risen. Exposure and water had done the rest. There was no confirmed sign of assault, no confirmed sign of abduction, no clear reason to keep the county awake much longer than it already had been. What had begun as a tense search narrowed into paperwork, then signatures, then silence. People who had spent the first day whispering in parking lots stopped whispering, not because the questions had been answered, but because the answer had already been chosen. And yet, the first detective assigned to the file did not seem convinced, at least not at once. Years later, when portions of the case papers were discussed by local researchers and former reporters, certain details stood out for the way they resisted the final summary. There was a notation about a back door in a nearby vacant property being found unlatched. There was mention of a broken drinking glass on a kitchen floor inside that same structure, despite no public statement ever linking the girl to the building. There was also a line, brief and badly typed, recording that a witness on the Ridge Road had heard a vehicle idling there sometime after midnight, long after the restaurants and gas stations had gone dark. That witness later seemed to vanish from the public record altogether. The vacant property became the part of the story that older residents still lowered their voices over. It was not a notorious place, only an old house left to weather at the edge of a field, with one leaning porch post and a front room that took on the smell of wet plaster every autumn. Teenagers had gone there now and then, hunters cut across the back lot. Nothing about it suggested a legend, at least not before the investigation touched it. But according to people who later claimed to have seen the early scene notes, there had been signs of recent movement inside. Mud on one stretch of floorboards and nowhere else. A chair pulled toward the window facing the road, a coat button that did not match the victim's clothes. Most troubling of all was a short sentence in an evidence inventory that referred to audio material recovered from rear bedroom. No description followed it. No transcript was attached. In the final case packet, that item was no longer there. Those omissions might have been clerical. Papers are misplaced, inventories are corrected, small departments are not always careful in the first frantic hours of a case. But the pattern ran deeper than a single missing item. A local reporter who kept copies of the earliest clippings noticed that the location of the body shifted from one account to the next. In one version, she had been found near the water, as though she had stumbled. In another, she had been found in a shallow depression above the bank where the frost had not yet melted around her hair. One report said her hands were bare, another said one glove was tucked into the pocket of her coat. The coat itself moved through the story in an even stranger way: folded, torn, missing, recovered later. There was never one stable description. It was as though the physical facts of the scene had been gradually pressed into a shape that better suited the conclusion. The family, according to public statements and later recollections, did not stop asking for a clearer explanation. They questioned the speed of the ruling. They questioned why some early comments from investigators had been softened or withdrawn. They questioned how a young woman could leave a lit parking lot, travel a route no one could map with confidence, and end up in a place that several officers initially treated as suspicious, only for that suspicion to evaporate within days. None of that proves foul play. It does not prove anything at all. But the unease came from the movement of the story itself. Facts usually grow firmer with time. In this case, they seemed to grow softer, blurred at the edges, as if each revision had been made not to sharpen the truth, but to make it less difficult to live with. Then there was the call. It appeared in some retellings and vanished in others, which only made it worse. According to discussions that surfaced years afterward, a 911 call came in during the hours before the body was found. The caller did not give a name. There was either breathing on the line or wind. Different people remembered it differently. One former dispatcher reportedly said a woman had tried to speak but stopped. Another version claimed there were two sounds, one close to the receiver and one farther back, like a chair scraping a floor. The call was not treated publicly as central to the case, and no complete recording has ever been widely released. Still, one reference to a distressed open line lingered in an internal log summary. It was time-stamped well after the victim had last been seen and close enough to the discovery of the body to trouble anyone who noticed it. The most unsettling part was not that the call existed, but that it sat beside a note suggesting the phone later recovered with the victim showed water exposure so severe that investigators were uncertain whether it could have been used during that window at all. That contradiction was never fully explained in public. Perhaps the call came from someone else. Perhaps the timing was off. Perhaps a deputy wrote down the wrong device. Those are ordinary possibilities. But the file did not read like a file that had encountered an ordinary mistake and corrected it. It read like a file that had stepped around certain facts and left them behind in the dark. A retired clerk from the courthouse, speaking years later to someone collecting local case histories, described the folder itself in a way that people in town still repeated. She said it felt thinner than it should have. She said there were places where pages had clearly once been fastened together and no longer were. She remembered an evidence sheet with item numbers continuing in sequence until one line, where a space had been left large enough for several words and then crossed through with a single pen stroke. She could not recall what had been written there first. She only remembered that the ink used to strike it out was darker and newer than the type on the rest of the page. That is a small thing. It might mean nothing. In a room full of old files, almost everything looks altered, but the image stayed with people because it fit too neatly with the rest of the case. Not destroyed, not solved, only adjusted. As the years passed, the town did what small towns do with unresolved stories. It set them down in layers. The older generation spoke about carelessness, favoritism, and officials who wanted the matter finished before it stained the county too deeply. Younger people added a different edge. They talked about the empty house, they talked about the rear bedroom and the missing audio. Some said a hunter had once gone inside there at dusk and found old police tape in a dresser drawer, though no one ever proved it. Others claimed that if a car stopped on the ridge road after midnight and the engine was cut, the creek below sounded wrong, not like moving water, but like somebody dragging a wet bundle through weeds. No one sensible called that evidence. It was only a rumor, the kind that grows where documents go silent. Still, there was one detail even the skeptics found difficult to shake. In one early photograph, reproduced badly in a local archive before access tightened, the vacant house could be seen in the background beyond the tree line. Its rear window reflected the morning in a flat, pale square. At first glance, there was nothing there. But a former reporter, looking closely years later, believed there was a shape at the glass. Not a face exactly, more like someone standing a step back from the window and watching the search below. The image quality was poor. It could have been curtain, glare, damage to the print. Yet that same reporter said the original contact sheet for the scene later seemed incomplete, with one frame missing between two shots taken seconds apart. He never proved that either. He only said that every time he tried to trace the sequence, the records broke apart in his hands. The county moved on, the house collapsed by degrees, the field behind it grew up wild. New deputies came in who knew the story only as something older officers dismissed with a tired look. Officially, nothing remained open. There was no murder to solve, no abductor to identify, no conspiracy waiting under the surface of public record. There was only a young woman whose death had been explained, and a town that did not quite believe the explanation it had been given. In daylight, that seemed manageable. At church suppers and football games, people spoke of other things. But on winter nights, when the roads emptied early and the hills held their breath, the old contradictions came back with the dark. Some said the worst part was how ordinary the file sounded if read quickly. It did not shout. It did not confess. It offered no final revelation hidden in a margin. It simply failed in a few quiet places to line up with itself. A coat where it should not have been. Shoes too clean for the bank. A house entered and then forgotten. An item of audio recovered and then no longer mentioned. A call that arrived from nowhere and settled nowhere. These were not answers. They were absences shaped like answers, and that was what made the case endure. An unsolved crime can be named, an accident can be mourned, but a story that has been gently pressed into the wrong shape leaves behind a different kind of fear, one with no edge to hold. Long after the papers were boxed away, there were people in that part of southern Ohio who still slowed when they passed the old pull-off above the creek. They did it without meaning to. They looked down through the brush, past the black water and the low tangle of branches, toward the place where the first flashlights moved before dawn and the first version of the truth had briefly shown itself. Then they drove on, back toward the lit houses and the gas stations and the safer explanations. But the feeling stayed with them. Not that something supernatural had happened there, not even that the town had uncovered a monster and hidden it, only that somewhere in the first hours, before the signatures and the final ruling, somebody had seen one detail too many, and that detail had been trimmed away so the rest could close around it. What remained was smaller than a haunting and colder than a legend. It was the possibility that the most disturbing thing in the file had never been the death at all, but the care with which certain parts of it had been made to disappear. Every night at 3:17, someone knocked in Cedar Rapids. The first knock came while the house was already awake. It was not loud. That was what the woman remembered later, when she tried to explain why she had not called anyone the first night or the second. It was too measured for panic, too polite for danger. 3 slow strikes against the front door, each one spaced evenly, as if a visitor stood on the porch with one gloved hand raised in the dark, certain that sooner or later someone inside would answer. When she looked at the clock on the stove, the green numbers had just changed to 3:17 a.m. By the time she reached the little pane of glass beside the door, the porch was empty. The street beyond it was empty too. The houses along the block were dark, their windows black and shut, their yards silvered faintly by a weak street lamp at the corner. There had been no footsteps on the steps, no car engine, no shape moving away across the lawn. Only the cold white reflection of her own face in the glass, and the sense that whoever had knocked had done it with complete confidence, as though the silence afterward mattered more than the sound itself. The next night, it happened again. 3 knocks, the same careful rhythm, the same time. Her husband sat up in bed before the third one landed. He had heard it too. This time, he went to the door immediately, flicking on the porch light as he moved, opening it fast enough to catch anyone who might have been hiding close to the frame. But the porch was bare. The steps were bare, the sidewalk was bare. A little wind moved through the dry leaves gathered under the hedge, and somewhere farther down the street, a dog began barking in a nervous, strangled way, then cut itself off all at once. In the morning, they found nothing on the porch. No prank, no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the damp strip of dirt near the flower bed. The husband walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows, the alley, the detached garage. Everything was shut, everything was still. After 4 nights, the woman mentioned it to a neighbor, expecting embarrassment on her own face as she spoke. Instead, she saw recognition. The neighbor did not answer right away. He stood with one hand on his trash bin, looking past her toward the row of houses, as if choosing whether to say what he knew. Then he asked what time it happened. When she told him, he let go of the bin slowly. According to later accounts, that was the first time anyone on the block understood the complaints were not separate. One family on the next street had heard knocking at 3:17 a.m. for nearly 2 weeks and had assumed it was teenagers. An older man living alone had reported the same thing a month earlier, though by then the police had found no one on his property and no damage to the house. A renter 3 blocks away claimed the knocks had started after the house next door was vacated and continued even after the power was shut off inside it. None of the reports sounded serious by daylight. They became serious only when spoken together. Soon, people were waking before the sound came. Some sat in darkened living rooms and stared at their front doors from across the room, waiting for the hour to turn. Some watched from upstairs windows where they could see the porch and the sidewalk at once. One man on the corner kept his truck idling in the driveway, headlights pointed straight at the front steps. Another left a floodlight burning all night over the front walk, but the pattern did not change. At 3:17 a.m., there would come that same restrained knocking from the front entrance. Never frantic, never hurried, never repeated after the first set. Whoever heard it and rushed outside found nothing. The strangest report came from a woman who had moved out for a week to stay with her sister. She had not wanted to sleep in the house anymore. Her youngest son had begun waking before the knocks, sitting up in bed and whispering that someone was standing on the porch without a face. The boy was too young, in her view, to understand how to frighten adults properly, and that made it worse. So she packed clothes, took the children, and left the place empty. Her husband stayed elsewhere as well. No one remained inside the house. A neighbor across the street told police that the knocking still came. Night after night, at the same time, 3 measured strikes on the front door of a house that no longer held anyone at all. It should have ended there, in that category of quiet local disturbances that never become anything larger. A prankster could not be caught. A prowler could not be identified. There were no injuries, no broken locks, no theft, no body lying in a yard, only sound, only repetition. The kind of thing that turns into rumor because rumor is easier to hold than an unanswered fact. But then people began noticing details that did not belong together. One resident later said, the knocks never sounded like knuckles on wood. He had assumed they did, because what else could they be? Yet once he sat close enough to the entryway to hear them from inside the front room, he thought the sound was wrong. Too hollow, perhaps, or too flat, as if whatever struck the door had no give to it. Another said the sound seemed to come from shoulder height, then chest height, then lower, though always on the same door. A retired carpenter on the block told neighbors that the front panel on his door carried the vibrations strangely, almost as if the impact landed on the outside and the inside at once. Several people began leaving powder on their porches. Flour, mostly, sometimes ash from fireplaces. One man spread a clean layer of dust from the edge of the welcome mat all the way to the top step, hoping to catch shoe prints. In the morning, the powder remained smooth, untouched, except for the thin score where the door had swung open after the knocks and the family had rushed out again. No footprints approached. No footprints left. According to local retellings, one household set a chair directly against the inside of the front door and waited with the father seated in it, hand pressed to the wood. The knocks came on schedule. He leaped back afterward and told his wife, with a face that had gone pale in a way she had never seen before, that he had heard the sound clearly but felt nothing touch the door at all. Autumn came in slowly, flattening the lawns and turning the trees brittle around the edges. The neighborhood learned the hour by instinct. Lamps burned later than they used to. Window curtains remained cracked just enough for one suspicious eye. In daylight, people laughed at themselves because daylight demanded it. They discussed raccoons, pipes, branches, settling wood, bored teenagers, some trick of distance that made a sound from elsewhere land on a front porch. Yet every explanation broke on the same fact. The knocking happened at 3:17 a.m., in the same rhythm, under too many different conditions, whether the houses were occupied or empty, lit or dark, watched or unwatched. One of the houses had been empty long enough to begin looking blind. The grass had gone coarse around the foundation. Circular marks from flower pots remained on the porch where nothing sat anymore. The front window had a paper notice folded against the glass from the inside, pale and unreadable from the street. Local residents later disagreed over whether that house had ever received the knocks before it was vacated or only after. But more than one person claimed that if they stood outside at the right angle after midnight, they could see movement behind the front curtains even though the power was off and the place had been cleared. A patrol car was sent more than once. Officers found quiet streets, locked doors, tired homeowners standing barefoot on front walks in robes and coats, each one embarrassed to be there. Official responses, insofar as anyone remembered them, were practical and brief. There was no suspect, no evidence of attempted entry, no sign anyone had been on the property. Disturbance complaints were taken, noted, and folded into the ordinary paper drift of city life. But one story remained, repeated years afterward in lowered voices, because it attached itself to a uniform and therefore sounded more solid than the rest. The story said that one officer arrived just before the hour and parked with his headlights off halfway down the block. He waited in the car where he could see two front porches at once. At 3:17 a.m., he heard the knocks. He was certain of that. 3 even blows. He also saw, or believed he saw, that neither porch light changed, no door opened, no person stood on either set of steps. The sound seemed to arrive without a source. He drove up at once, checked the yards, and found the street completely empty. Years later, depending on who told it, the officer either requested no more overnight calls to that block or laughed the matter off and refused to discuss it. Stories like that tend to harden where facts are thin. The woman from the first house began sleeping in the back room. It changed nothing. The knocking still reached her, muted by distance but exact in its timing. One night, after weeks of poor sleep, she made a decision that embarrassed her even in the moment. She moved quietly through the dark house, unlocked the front door, and opened it a few inches before the hour, leaving the chain latched so the porch showed only as a slim column of night. She wanted to prove something to herself. If there was a prankster, the open crack would reveal movement. If there was someone standing close to the frame, they might speak. If it was all imagination, then the empty porch might settle the matter once and for all. The house stood in silence around her. A refrigerator motor clicked on and off. Somewhere, a board shifted faintly in the hallway. From outside came nothing at all. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the door moved under the chain. Not inward by much, not enough to throw metal hard against metal. Just a careful pressure from the other side, as if someone had placed a hand against the edge and discovered, with mild surprise, that it was already open. The woman later said she heard no knock that night, only that pressure, only the slow testing of the door, followed by stillness so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She slammed it shut and woke her husband in tears he had no way to comfort. After that, other sounds entered the reports. A faint tread on front steps after the knocks, though no one was seen. A whisper outside the storm door that could not be made out. The scrape of something along the porch railing. One family found their wind chime hanging perfectly still after the sound, even though the trees overhead were moving in a steady breeze. Another found the brass knocker on their door warm to the touch, though they swore no one had used it. The most unsettling detail did not come from the porches at all, it came from inside. More than one witness later claimed that on nights when the knocking was heard, a second sound followed several moments later from deeper in the house. Not always, not in every house, but enough times to survive in retelling. A floorboard shifting in an empty upstairs room, a closet door easing against its frame, the soft impact of something settling in a hallway where no one stood. It was as though the sound at the front door was not asking to be let in, but announcing that something had already crossed the threshold by another route. By early winter, the block had changed its habits. People visited less after dark. Children were called indoors before evening fully set. The ordinary courtesy of neighborhood life thinned into tired nods and half-finished conversations in driveways. A few residents began keeping radios on through the night, low and steady, just to disturb the silence before the hour arrived. It did not help. The knocking came through radio static as easily as through stillness. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. For several nights, there was nothing. Then a week, then two. People did not trust the absence at first. They waited awake, then drowsing, then sleeping again. Porch lights went dark earlier, curtains were left open, the neighborhood loosened. Some said the cold had driven away whoever had been responsible. Some said the police had frightened off a prankster at last. Others did not offer theories. They only enjoyed the relief. The empty house remained empty through that stretch of quiet. Snow gathered shallowly along the walk and froze there in gray ridges. Circular drifts formed around the porch posts. The paper in the front window had yellowed more at the edges. One evening, a real estate worker came by to inspect the property before a sale and left after less than 20 minutes, though the weather was clear and there was still light enough to work. No reason was given. The lockbox stayed on the rail for a while after that, bumping lightly in the wind. When the new occupants finally arrived, neighbors watched from behind their curtains. A man and a woman, not old, with a rented truck and the tired, brittle cheerfulness of people trying to turn a strange house into a chosen one. They brought in boxes, lamps, kitchen chairs, a rolled rug, a mattress. The porch light burned warm above them. Several nearby residents considered crossing the street to say something. None of them did. Warning someone about a rumor requires believing it enough to sound foolish in another person's face. The first night passed without incident. The second night passed too. On the third morning, the woman from the original house woke before dawn to a sound she had hoped never to hear again. 3 slow knocks, exact, measured, unmistakable. She sat upright in bed, unable to breathe for a moment because the sound had not come from her own door this time. It had come from across the street, from the house that had stood empty through all those weeks of silence. According to what neighbors later pieced together, the new occupants had heard the knocking at 3:17 a.m. and assumed someone needed help. The man went downstairs while his wife stayed in the hall above. He opened the door. She heard him say nothing, or perhaps only a single word spoken too softly to carry. Then she heard the storm door close again. When she came down to the entryway, he was gone. His boots were still on the mat. His coat still hung over the banister. The front door was shut, but not locked. There were no footprints leading away from the porch, except the marks left later by police and neighbors searching the yard. No one on the block reported seeing a person crossing the street, entering a car, or moving through the alley. The man was simply no longer in the house. Searches were made. Questions were asked. The story spread beyond the neighborhood then, because a disappearance has weight that a sound does not. Yet, even in that larger telling, certainty remained difficult. Some said the man had a reason to leave and chose the hour for his own purposes. Some insisted there must have been evidence not shared publicly. Some rejected the link entirely, claiming frightened neighbors had sewn 2 unrelated events together into a legend. It is possible they were right. But local memory kept the order of things intact. The months of disturbance complaints, the empty porches, the watched houses, the exact time, the knocks continuing even when no one was home. And at the center of it, the feeling shared by those who heard them that the sound was never random, never testing, never confused. It was the sound of arrival. Years later, people on that side of Cedar Rapids still avoided certain kinds of silence. A few of the old houses were renovated, some were sold, families came and went, children grew up and left the block, carrying only fragments of the story with them. New owners often knew nothing about the complaints unless someone chose to tell them. Even then, the details changed from mouth to mouth. 3 knocks became 4, then returned to 3. The season shifted depending on the teller. The empty house moved 1 street over. That is the ordinary erosion of memory. Yet one detail survived with unusual strength, not because it could be proven, but because too many people repeated it exactly. Now and then, in the last dark stretch before dawn, a resident would wake for no clear reason and look at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Then would come that old, helpless stillness, the sense of a whole neighborhood holding its breath. On rare nights, someone still claimed to hear the knocks, not always on their own door, sometimes faint and far off, as if heard through several houses at once. 3 patient blows, then nothing. No one ever agreed on what would happen if a person opened the door quickly enough, or left it open before the sound arrived, or chose not to move at all. Theories survive because they are never tested in the one way that matters. The woman who first heard the knocking kept living in Cedar Rapids for years, but she never again stood waiting at the entryway before the hour. She slept with a lamp on in the back room and kept a chair beneath the knob until she moved away. The house where the man vanished changed hands more than once. In photographs taken during later listings, the front porch looks ordinary. 2 posts, narrow steps. A plain door with a small pane beside it that reflects the street. There is nothing in those images to suggest the place ever held more than routine unhappiness, more than the usual weathering of Midwestern winters and summers. Still, people who know the story tend to notice the same thing when they look too long. The porch appears as if someone has just stepped out of frame. And if the picture is viewed late enough at night, when the room behind the viewer has gone quiet and the glass begins to give back a faint reflection of the watcher's own face, there is sometimes the brief, absurd impression that another shape is standing closer to the door than it should be, waiting with one hand raised, patient as ever, for the minute to come around again. What they found in the basement in Pennsylvania wasn't supposed to be there. The first thing they noticed was the warmth. It was not much, only a shallow pocket of heat pressed against the damp cold of the basement wall in a place where no pipe should have been running and no sunlight had touched for years. The house had been empty, according to the papers tied to the sale, for so long that neighbors had stopped calling it by the family name and simply referred to it as the old place at the tree line. Its windows were gray with dust, its porch had sunk crookedly into the weeds. Even in daylight, the rooms upstairs held the stale hush of somewhere that had stopped expecting voices. Yet in the basement, behind a shelving unit swollen with rot, one section of stone felt almost body warm when the contractor laid his palm against it. The owner had bought the property in late autumn, hoping to restore it before winter set in too hard. It was an older farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, the kind built in stages over many decades, with thick fieldstone walls below and timber additions above, patched and altered as generations needed more room. Local renovation reports on houses, like it often mentioned, root cellars, coal rooms, sealed cisterns, shallow crawl spaces under kitchens, and odd narrow voids left by older staircases or foundation changes. This house, from the beginning, seemed to have more of those spaces than it should. By the second day, the workers had already found one door hidden under paneling and another buried behind shelves in a pantry. Neither led anywhere stranger than expected. One opened to a linen recess no wider than a coffin, the other to a steep service stair descending to the basement. Houses of that age were full of forgotten practicalities. That was what one of the men said when the wall in the basement gave back that faint warmth, and everyone laughed more than the remark deserved. Then the crowbar slipped into a seam between the stones. It had been mortared over carefully, but not well enough to disappear from a patient eye. The stones along that section were older than the patch around them, darker with age, and when the bar bit in and twisted, a drift of pale mortar dust spilled down like dry ash. Behind the shelving unit, there was a vertical line, then a horizontal one. Not a wall, exactly. A fitted face. A cover. The men worked in silence after that. The sound of metal levering stone was slow and heavy, a dragging scrape followed by the soft collapse of grit onto the earth floor. When the first stone shifted, a cold draft passed over their hands. It smelled wrong. Not the sealed mineral smell of a long-closed cellar, not the sweet rot of old wood and wet dirt, but something layered and recent beneath the mildew. Smoke, faint but not ancient, damp wool, oil, and under it, the flat, unmistakable smell of a room that had been breathed in. The opening was too small at first to do more than shine a light through. The beams struck rough boards, a low ceiling, and a narrow space extending past the reach of the flashlight. One of the workers cursed softly. Another asked if there had been a floor plan. There had, but only a thin county copy and a survey that showed dimensions without much faith in their truth. Older rural homes were altered without permits more often than not. Walls were added, wells were covered. Spaces were hidden because a family needed somewhere to store winter food or liquor or something they did not want taxed or someone they did not want seen. By the time they widened the gap enough to crawl in, the owner had come down from upstairs and was standing on the basement steps with both hands in his jacket pockets as if he already regretted buying the place. The hidden room was longer than expected and lower than any of them liked. A grown person had to move through it bent at the waist. It had plank walls darkened by age, a packed dirt floor, and at the far end, a small raised platform made from boards set over old bricks. There were shelves, too, and on them a scatter of objects that should not have been there if the house had truly sat empty for years. A tin cup without much rust, a mason jar with a cloudy inch of water, a blanket folded once, not neatly, but recently enough that it had not yet taken on the shape of collapse. There were candle stubs, matches in a dry tin, a length of cord, 2 newer food cans with labels less faded than anything else in the basement, and near the platform, pressed into the dirt, marks that looked very much like the tread of a modern work boot. No one said squatters at first. That word came later in the kitchen when they stood around the table under the dead light fixture and looked at what had been carried up. The owner said maybe some teenager had gotten in here. One of the workers shook his head and said a teenager would have left wrappers, spray paint, beer cans, something careless and loud. This was different. The hidden room had the order of use. Not constant use, perhaps, but repeated. Careful. The blanket had been folded to leave room on the platform. The water jar had a cloth tied loosely over the mouth to keep dust out. Nothing in there had looked abandoned. It had looked paused. Outside, evening was already thickening around the fields. There were no nearby streetlights, only the long, dull spread of cloud over harvested land and the black firs crowding the rear edge of the property. In that light, the house seemed to withdraw into itself, each window darkening before the next. The owner asked whether they should call the sheriff. One man said they probably should. Another asked what exactly they would report. An empty room behind a wall, a blanket, some cans, a smell. In the end, they did call the non-emergency line, and an officer came out before full dark. He looked through the space, took down a few notes, and said it was impossible to say when anyone had last been there. Rural properties were hard to watch. Vacant homes drew hunters, drifters, curious kids, scavengers, sometimes people simply trying to stay out of sight for a few nights. He advised changing the locks and keeping the place secured until the work was done. He did not seem especially alarmed until one of the men mentioned the warmth in the wall. Even then, he only frowned, crouched, and shone his own light around the hidden room with a more serious patience than before. At the far end, above the platform, there was a slit in the boards. Narrow, easy to miss. It ran horizontally between 2 planks and had been drilled through again and again in tiny dark holes as if someone had widened a knot or made a line of peepholes no bigger than pencil erasers. The officer leaned in close. Then he asked what room sat on the other side. The kitchen. He stood up very slowly after that. When they tested it from above, the answer became worse. The hidden room was tucked beneath the rear section of the house, where no room should have existed at all, in the dead space below the kitchen pantry and part of the mudroom. The line of holes looked not into the basement, but upward through a concealed cavity toward the underside of the floorboards. Sound traveled through it. So did a thread of lamplight when they set a work light on the kitchen floor and went back below. A person in that hidden room could have listened to movement overhead. They could have heard chairs scrape back from the table, heard someone rinse a glass at the sink, heard the old floor creak under slow midnight footsteps. The officer told the owner not to stay there. That would have been reasonable advice even without the hidden room, given the state of the place, but he said it with a flatness that made everyone listen. The next morning, two of the workers refused to go back into the space unless someone stood watch outside. They laughed when they said it, but not very convincingly. They had begun demolition in the upstairs bath and were halfway through hauling plaster when one of them came down complaining of a tapping sound. Not in the walls generally, but underfoot. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more. They all stood still to hear it. Nothing came. The owner told them old houses knocked all the time, pipes contracted, framing settled, mice moved through the voids. The men agreed. Then one asked, without looking at anyone, why the tapping had stopped the moment all of them had gone quiet. It was later that afternoon that they found the second sign. The basement door had been left propped open for ventilation. Rain had started while they were working upstairs, and a trail of damp marks led in from the back of the house, across the basement floor, and toward the broken opening in the wall. They were not clean footprints. More like the darkened edges of them, as if wet soles had picked up cellar dust and left brief, imperfect shadows behind. There were enough to follow, and then there were none, though the dirt inside the hidden room at first showed no fresh impressions deeper than the ones already there. One of the men backed out immediately and said he was done. The officer returned, this time with another deputy. They searched the house, the attic, the crawl under the porch, the outbuildings half collapsed in the weeds, and the strip of woods behind the property where old farm trash had sunk into leaf mold over decades. They found no one. A bedroom upstairs, however, which had remained closed while the contractors worked other parts of the house, showed a detail the owner swore had not been there the day before. The dust on the bureau had been disturbed in a smooth round patch, as if a hand or bowl or lamp had rested there briefly. Beside it lay a single match, unburned, from the same old paper brand found in the hidden room. After that, the men stopped staying until dusk. Stories began in the loose way they do around isolated properties. A neighbor from farther down the road remembered hearing that one of the earlier owners had partitioned odd spaces in the cellar during Prohibition, though whether that had been for whiskey or for fear, no one could say. Another local man claimed the farmhouse had once sheltered a relative who came back from war, changed and violent and preferred small enclosed places, though he admitted he had only heard that from his father. An elderly woman in town said there had been talk years earlier of someone living in the walls of an abandoned house near the county line, slipping out at night for food and vanishing before dawn, but she could not say if it was the same property or merely one of those rural stories that migrate from road to road until they attach themselves wherever there is enough darkness to hold them. None of that explained the ash. It was discovered on the 3rd evening after the wall was opened. The workers had left before sunset. The owner, against advice, had returned alone to check on tools and lock up. He found a shallow gray spill on the floor of the hidden room beside the raised platform, with one blackened twist of wick lying in it. The ash was dry. When he touched the center with a screwdriver tip, it still held a little warmth, as if a candle had burned there not long before. He left immediately and called from the truck, not willing to go back inside, even for the padlock he had forgotten on the porch rail. This time, the search was more serious. More lights, more voices, mud tracked through the yard. The deputies brought a dog, but the rain that had passed over the fields had muddled the ground into a broad, wet confusion. If someone had approached on foot, there was no clear trail to follow. If they had been inside before the owner arrived, there was no certainty of when they had left. The house gave up only small things: a fresh scrape on the basement threshold, a fragment of wax, the smell of smoke lingering in the hidden room and nowhere else. One deputy asked to see the old survey again. He stood over it in the kitchen with his flashlight beam crossing the paper, then went back below and measured from foundation to foundation. His numbers did not settle right. The hidden room matched part of the missing distance, but not all of it. There appeared to be another void beyond the rear wall, narrower and deeper, inaccessible from the first. The house, in other words, contained more darkness than it admitted. No one broke that second wall that night. The owner paid for a temporary camera system instead. Motion sensors, battery lights, a portable monitor set in the truck. The installers arrived the next day and moved quickly, eager to finish before evening. One camera faced the basement stairs, another the opening in the false wall. A third was placed inside the hidden room itself, fixed on the platform and shelves. The owner told no one outside the work crew, and he did not stay on the property after dark. The footage, when it came, was less useful than it should have been. For hours, there was nothing but dust passing like pale gnats across the infrared glow. The basement stairs remained empty, the hidden room sat still, all edges and black corners. Shortly after midnight, the camera inside the room lost focus for several seconds. When the image cleared, the blanket was no longer folded. It lay spread across the platform, flattened as if something had leaned or lain on it. No movement was visible during the blur. No person crossed the frame before or after. The timestamp held steady. The battery level was normal. The technician later suggested interference, moisture, cheap equipment. He did not explain the blanket. On the next night, the camera facing the basement stairs caught sound before motion. Not a footstep exactly. A slow drag, then a pause, then another. The audio was thin and distant, but it had a careful rhythm to it, as if someone barefoot were trying not to knock against the risers. The frame showed only the lower half of the stairwell. No body descended into view, yet a shadow passed across the wall, broadening and narrowing with the shape of someone moving between the camera and the weak light from above. After that, the signal from every camera cut at once. The owner never moved into the house. That much is certain in the versions of the story that survived the work itself. Some say the restoration was abandoned within the week. Some say the basement was filled and sealed, the opening bricked over, and the rear foundation left untouched. Others insist the contractors did continue for a time, but only in daylight, and only after one of them found a spoon, recently washed clean, lying in the kitchen sink of a house no one had entered that morning. Publicly discussed accounts of vacant homes in the United States sometimes include strange evidence of hidden occupation, people living in attics, crawl spaces, basements, wall voids, or unused service areas without the owners knowing. Investigators usually settle on the living before the dead, trespassers, runaways, people hiding from warrants, weather, or other people. That explanation is always possible here. It is the one that makes the most sense. It is also the explanation that leaves the narrow listening holes under the kitchen floor, the warm ash, and the spread blanket in the camera blur exactly where they were. Years later, according to local retellings, the place still stood for a while beyond the field road, more collapsed each season, windows dark, porch gone soft with rot. Hunters avoided it. Teenagers drove out to look at it and did not stay long. One winter, a neighbor passing after sundown reportedly saw a thread of yellow light moving low behind the basement stones, not steady like electricity, but trembling, as if from a candle being carried by hand. By the time he stopped his truck and looked again, the light had gone. The property eventually changed hands. Fences came down, brush reclaimed the back lot. The house itself was said to have been partially dismantled, though no one seems to agree on how much remained and how much was simply swallowed by neglect. But the story stayed attached to that patch of Pennsylvania ground, not because anyone proved what was in the basement, and not because anyone confirmed anything supernatural, but because of one simple detail in the renovation reports and in the memory of the men who had first opened the wall. The hidden space did not feel discovered. It felt interrupted. And if the house had truly been vacant for all those years, if no one had been sleeping under the kitchen and listening through the floorboards, then there was still no comfortable reason for the folded blanket, the recent cans, the drifting warmth in the stone, or the ash that was warm to the touch in a room no one had entered before the owner opened it. There are old houses that settle, old houses that hide things, and old houses that preserve traces of the people who passed through them. Then there are houses with spaces shaped not for storage, but for waiting. In the stories told afterward, that was what unnerved everyone most. Not the possibility that someone had once hidden there, but the quieter possibility that someone had learned the house well enough to remain inside it whenever they pleased, hearing every footstep overhead, and had only stepped back into the dark while strangers broke through the wall that was never supposed to be opened.